Hello everybody, I'm Lauren from Kelly and I'm joined with all of these great people here at truLondon this afternoon for our penultimate live stream track of the day. I'd like to introduce to you our track leader, Miranda from Worldblu, who's going to be talking to us about the democratic workplace and freedom at work. And over to you.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with a question. Does anyone know or have any idea of what democracy at work is all about? Anyone?
Blank faces.
Freedom at work.
Would it involve sort of merit-based management, whereas it's not involved in dictatorial management?
Not dictatorial
Not
management.
dictatorial. That's what I mean. So
Yeah.
the opposite of dictatorial management.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, flat hierarchies, probably how you communicate within a company.
Mm-hmm.
If you get fired by just posting something on Facebook, or
Anyone else?
Sounds like it should include policies around diversity, maybe in the workplace, and
It could
that
do,
kind of
yeah.
stuff as well.
Does it also extend as far as you saying, I think I've got the skills and capability and competency to do this task that needs to be done? Is that as far as it goes?
Yeah, it could be more than that though. It could be giving people the freedom to explore that more without consequences, to allow higher levels of innovation to come through and creativity. So essentially, what we believe freedom at work is an organisation where people operate from a place of freedom and possibility rather than fear and control. And over the last 15 years, we've been certifying workplaces that are operating from this premise around the world, who've taken a scorecard to measure that. And we have now developed what we call the Freedom at Work cycle, which is a cycle that an organisation needs to go through to be considered to be practicing freedom at work. And it starts with a mindset of freedom rather than fear. And it goes on to design, which is how you intentionally design your organisation. And out of that come the practices of how you put that design and that mindset into action, which is your culture. So the bit that we're going to focus on today is the design. And when I say design, they are businesses, organisations that have been intentionally designed on a basis of 10 principles of what we call organisational democracy. And when we started out 15 years ago, no one was talking about accountability and transparency, but those are two of them. And I think one of the things that we were going to talk about today was some of the organisations that are practicing this way, because it's not a woo-woo idea. There is actual quantitative proof to show that workplaces that operate from this premise have a positive bottom line, higher levels of innovation, and quite frankly, better levels of resilience. So,
and are they always aware that this is what they're doing? Because I'm wondering that there must be a lot of workplaces out there, for example, who've got their policies and they've got their own mission and values, who are encompassing some of this and what you're talking about now. So what are you finding? Are you finding that people are building their values around that, or that vice versa, the values fit into the democratic workplace?
Both.
Okay.
Both. So, you have companies like Zappos, who a lot of people have heard of. They're an online retailer in the US. They're one of the companies that we've certified. They built their organization this way from the ground up. So it's not like they went and took these principles and put them in. They'd actually, before they'd heard about us, they'd already started doing that naturally. And they built their values around these principles as well, their core values. If you look on their website, they have 10 core values which govern everything they do in their workplace. They use them to drive their recruitment, to drive the way that they interview, the way that they train people when they join the organisation. For them, culture is more important than skill. They hire for culture first, skill second, because you can train people. And one of the things that typifies them as well is that they have one of the highest numbers of people that want jobs with them. It's highly competitive. Once you actually manage to get through the recruitment process, they put you through a 1-month recruitment training when you join the organisation. Everyone, regardless of their role, does it, even the CEO. So essentially they have a call centre, and they want everyone to be able to pick up the phone and serve a customer with that high level of satisfaction. And they want them to have the training to understand the culture and how to apply that not only at work but throughout their life. So they also recognise, though, that probably for around 10% of the people that join the organisation, after the first week, they might be thinking, oh, this is too much for me, this is too big a step. And they would rather pay people to leave the organisation because they're not the right culture fit than to invest time and money in training them when it's never going to work. So they'll actually pay, I think it's around $5,000 now, at the end of that first week.
Should you let me know which companies are running this procedure? Not a lot of quick things, not really.
At this point, I think Zappos is probably the biggest example of it that I know. But they pay you at the end of the first week. They'll come and say, if you want to go now, it's fine. We'll pay you $5,000 plus your time, and that stands until the end of that month, I believe.
Sounds like you should be haggling there, shouldn't you?
Yeah.
If you want me to go, it's going to cost you £2.
The earliest room.
Well, if you're not going to be the right culture fit.
It's just if you don't want to.
Yeah, but it sounds like the employee was approached because it could be seen that they weren't.
No, all of them.
No, they'll approach all of them.
Everybody
They'll
at the
approach them in
first
a group.
week or
Yeah.
month training gets the offer. 3,000. I thought it was 3,000.
It's gone up.
$5,000 to go now, or you stay. And most people stay.
Yes. Yeah, most people do. But they also do a lot of work, and this is another thing that typifies a lot of these organisations. They do a lot of work throughout the organisation on culture. So they'll be looking at, well, you know, how do we create wow? One of their values is creating wow experiences for their customers. How do we create wow experiences? And that goes back into the principle of individual and collective, and possibly reflection, because they give their staff the power to actually write personal notes to the customers to say, hope you enjoyed the pair of shoes that I just arranged to mail to you. Or they'll give them the freedom to stay on a call with a customer for as long as they like. And I think it's gone up now, but the last time I was there, they were telling us about a woman who stayed on a call with a client, with a customer, for 8 hours. And they didn't even sell her a pair of shoes at the end of it. But they created a wow experience, and that was more important to them than selling the pair of shoes, because it went back to their core value.
I'm wondering how many companies, just like you said there, from that experience, how many companies can actually, in a way, afford to do this? You know, how many companies have got the financial backing and, you know, all the rest of it to be able to sustain that kind of model? Mm-hmm. And are there companies who are doing this who don't have the big brand name, like Zappos, for example?
Yeah, in fact, the majority that we work with don't have necessarily the big brand name. We work with organisations with everything from 5 employees up to 90,000-ish. And whilst we have the metrics to show that the larger organisations, you know, have grown, HCL, for example, have grown year on year 21% during the recession. DaVita, who are a kidney dialysis healthcare company, have gone from being bankrupt in 1999 practically to having a turnover of $12 billion and 50,000 employees. They've transformed their organisation that way. And then you have, as you say, the smaller organisations. And for some of them, there are more than just bottom line benefits to working this way. They want to be able to make a difference. You know, we were in the earlier session about making a difference.
But what do you think is the, you know, because if a company's setting up and now they perhaps want to be different, or they're tapped into the Gen Y giving value back, but if it's an existing corporate that perhaps got very entrenched, you know, work practices, what would be the trigger for them to become such a democratic workforce?
What's the catalyst for them?
It's usually, it can be a number of factors. It can be losing market share. It can be...
but would they make that jump to say then,
Could
the
they
solution to this? Yeah, how do they...
In a lot of industries, I just imagine it would just not be possible. I mean, when you're starting from scratch, particularly in the online space or whatever, I think you go down that route. I think
ideals flat anyway.
I've an observation that in some industries, for example, I recruit within the computer games industry. If you're making a computer game, could not be anything but a democratic environment. So they're probably practicing the majority of your 10 principles in any event.
Almost by
but
default.
I think in some industries it's just not practical.
Yeah, that would be. Do you have an example of a company that is that we're successfully transforming and is around for, let's say, 50 years? You know, I mean, Zappos isn't that old.
Not over 50 years, but probably the best example of a transformation of a workplace isn't within the IT sector, though, because there are loads in the IT sector. But the best one I know is a company called DaVita, which are a kidney dialysis company. They don't operate here in the UK because we have the NHS, but they do have a global presence. They are in the healthcare industry, one of the most litigious industries in the world. And in 1999, they were 6 weeks away from bankruptcy. Their FD literally would open his desk drawer every day and decide who was going to get a check that day. They had grown through acquisition and not been able to deliver on that. And they brought in a new CEO who very quickly realized that actually the knowledge wasn't going to come from within the C-suite. It was going to come from the employees, from the bottom line employees, from the people who'd actually been on the coalface delivering to their customers. And if they were going to turn this organisation around, they had to do it really quickly. So he invited everyone who wanted to onto a conference call and essentially laid it out to them. If we don't do something now, this company's going under and you are not going to get paid. And he shared that information and he asked people what to do to transform, and they gave him the ideas. And interestingly, the other thing that came out of this is that he recognized that a company is a community first. And so they've done their whole culture branding around being a village of citizens rather than a company of individuals. They're a village of citizens, and they call themselves community first, company second, because they absolutely recognise the power of the collective, as well as individual efforts, but the power of the collective to move them forward.
I'll just ask a question how wide that community is, because again, if I look at most corporates that I know, probably the minority of people that actually work for or on behalf of that organisation are now actually on the payroll. So in terms of your employees versus the people who work for on behalf of an organisation, how far does that actual opportunity extend? It's a very high percentage because they're all healthcare workers, so they're working in the business. But for taking those organisations where the actual employed workforce is now in the minority, and that number is, those companies are growing, how do you extend that out through across all those different dynamics of joint ventures, outsourced services, transient population of contractors and freelancers and temps? That's your workforce. Yeah, absolutely. We see a number of different examples. There's a company in the States who were until very recently totally home-based. They had 450 employees that worked from home, but they set up systems and processes, and this is the really key thing. You have to set up systems and processes that allow that level of democracy and innovation to flourish. And so they had set up systems that made sure that their managers could check in on the employees, that they were motivated, that they were being rewarded. And then you have a lot of workforces, which is very typical now, which is extremely diverse, as you've said. So you've got some people that are based in the office, you've got some people that are at home, you've got some people that are contractors. And in what typifies most of these workplaces with regards to contractors is that they do actually have a stake in the business. They have a company email address, they have a voice, just as any typical employee would in the ongoing work in the business. And if they're doing that, then they actually do have a role just as much as an employee. And I'm probably just thinking slightly further to, if you've outsourced your finance function to Capita, actually the employer of those people is actually Capita. So you've kind of got this dual cultural side of things. So there's one agenda, which is the organisation that you're providing the service for, but equally there's another agenda, which is a culture, which is the one that pays your paycheck. Is there also there possibly a separation? I know it's a whole organisation effect you're trying to achieve, but maybe if you've outsourced a financial function or an administration function,
possibly it's less important for the people in that outsourced part to buy into the whole.
Apart from if they're customer facing.
Yeah, unless they're customer facing. That's what I'm saying. But I think there's quite large chunks of this that aren't customer facing, where maybe it's not such an issue.
Well, I have to say, I haven't come across a company within our network that outsources quite to that degree. However, to your point about customer facing though, there's a company called HCL Technologies. They're the largest one that we work with 90,000 employees, headquartered in Delhi. And they went through a transformation because they were losing market share up against IBM and Microsoft in 2005. And their CEO realized that actually they needed to put the power for change in the hands of those people right at the coalface. So he talks about turning the organizational pyramid on its head and essentially saying to the employees in what he called the value zone, those customer-facing employees, what do we need to do to enable you to be able to serve our customers in the best way possible? They came up with the ideas. They told them the leaders what to do. And in fact, when they saw the recession coming in 2008, they realized that they were going to have to lay off some staff unless they could save $100 million to ride out the recession. So instead of keeping that inside the board, they said to the employees, we don't want to lay any of you off. We need to save $100 million. Give us your ideas. And they used an online suggestion box, and a committee of employees decided which to put into action. I think they put in around 76 into action, and they saved $260 million, and they didn't have to lay anyone off.
And I think that's all about it. A lot of what everybody seems to be saying on this subject is about being brave, and it's being brave on the C-suite. And I'm just wondering how many companies out there are willing to take that sort of step, because that's a brave decision. You know, that can go one way or the other, and you know, they obviously had the culture to sustain that decision, and it worked for them.
Often in a recession, people retrench rather than actually think, I know the excellent example of the analysis people, but generally speaking, it seems to be that people go, right, we'll keep doing more of what we were doing before, but on a smaller scale, and they don't think what we're going to do.
Also, you seem to see the mindset in the workforce to want to make this happen. I mean, historically, hierarchical businesses, very much owned top down, tend to hire people who function best in those organisations. People who might challenge, might have ideas, tend to be passed over because they might be seen as being a problem, they might be seen as being a bit kind of loose cannon. So are there examples where maybe the C-suite have said we need to do this, but kind of the rest of the business haven't really been able to step up?
Yeah, it comes back to mindset, I have to say. You know, it goes back to the first stage of that freedom at work cycle, which is a mindset of fear rather than freedom. And that's the biggest shift that people individually have to make before collectively you can even go down this road. And one of the things that we do is we work with organisations. Although we certify organisations, we work with a number that are actually on the path. And it starts with looking at your capability, your current capability. And the demand could in some cases come from your workers. But if your leaders aren't ready to step up to the plate and model a behaviour to enable change to happen, then it's never going to get off the ground. And that's the biggest mind shift and the biggest piece of work that we generally find ourselves doing, is helping the leadership. Because they recognise people wouldn't go down this road unless they recognise that there are huge benefits to doing this. You know, it's not just the bottom line. It's people innovation, it's attracting talent, Gen X, Gen Y issues.
There's so many side benefits to it, aren't there? Once those silos are broken down, I'm sure, in terms of intercollaboration and things that would come out that probably never would have done before.
Exactly, yeah.
But like you say, it's starting the journey. I'm sure once it's almost like a snowball effect once you've started. But also I think it's about companies being aware of this. That to me was the biggest thing, kind of what I asked before, was about how companies really consider this as an option, because it is quite a new concept and it's very, very different from a typical hierarchical organisation.
But I think it's also generational, isn't it? Because I think you know, people coming out of schools and colleges now, Generation Y, have this democratic management as a principle that they want to behold, these people will be in the C-suite, as we've been saying, in 20, 30 years' time. So all companies that
5
will
years'
be,
time.
yes, hopefully. So all these people, when they're setting up their own companies, are more likely to be going down this route rather than the old smokestack manufacturing industries that we're inheriting now, where they can't lose grip on or lose control of the workforce. So there is an argument to say that in 10, 20 years' time, all companies that are successful are going to be running along or close to this model.
But they're
they come out now with a lot more exposure to collaborative working than probably a few years ago at school, where it's very kind of solo study. So I think they want to see this in the workplace, but I think with a lot of things, you've got desire at the bottom. I hate to use a hierarchical thing. You've got desire at the bottom, desire at the top. It's the middle management level, which tends to be the one which has kind of worked hard to rise to a management level, who maybe are resistant to change, who kind of fear, and this is the same with adopting social media. They fear the transparency, the authenticity, the fact that collaborative working flattens hierarchies, and there's almost like ownership of a turf.
Yes.
So I suspect that even when you've got the top and the bottom saying yes, you've still got a layer to go.
If you do have the top and the bottom, though, one of the things that we're starting to see happen now is because you've got those two levels, and there are people in the middle, they're beginning to get left out because they're realising that, okay, people coming up are wanting this, the leadership are wanting this. Do I jump on the bandwagon or do I go? And that seems to be a question that people that are threatened, and it comes from a standpoint of fear, quite honestly, are always going to do. And we do have examples of companies who have gone through cultural change that has come from the bottom and the top. And when it's come to crunch time and people have realised this is really gathering momentum, there's no going back on this because we can see this is starting to be a really good thing for the organisation. It forces individuals to think, well, do I stay? Do I go? What can I give to the collective here? And people will either change and grow and challenge their fear, or on odd occasions there are people who just are strong enough to put their hand up and say this isn't right for me. And that goes back to the Zappos point of, they would rather pay people to leave because to them culture is more important, and they can show that that's actually had the bottom line benefit for them. So it's a really tough one because obviously you want everyone to stay, but it comes down to a very individual decision, I think.
Do you have any examples of this within the recruitment world?
No, I do.
Because we're all so innovative anyway.
It's not a dictatorship at all, is it?
Well, why not?
I wish I did, and I would love to be able to transform a recruitment organisation and give you an example in next time. Maybe, who knows? But the closest example I have is of an organisation here in the UK called Future Considerations, and they're change management consultants, but they weren't kind of talking. They weren't walking the talk that they were doing with their clients internally. And actually it took one of the younger people in the organisation writing an email to the whole organisation, it's a small company, saying, this organisation's dying, what are we going to do about it? And they actually ended up taking a scorecard that we produced to measure how well they were doing, and they didn't do particularly well. They won't mind me talking about this. And what it did spur was an off-site for, I think it was a week, and they literally just all cancelled client work and decided this was too important for the stake of the future of the company. They had some really tough conversations, really, really tough, and they decided, the collective decided that for the future of the organisation this was something they had to explore. They figured out by the end of those few days together an 8-month path to transformation. And a year later, they took the scorecard again, thinking that, well, if we've got a little bit further along, that would be great. Actually, they got a lot further along than they thought, but they had invested the time in it. And there were people one or two people who said, this isn't for me. at this point I need to leave. But I remember one of them saying to me, he said, I had been challenged with a lot in my life, personally and professionally, for a while. This was an opportunity for me to grow, and it gave me the chance to actually handle some stuff that had been looming for ages, and it was the best thing for me. So, you know, that's why I say it's a very individual thing for folks.
There's clear success stories there. I mean, I'm just thinking back to courses maybe when I was a young manager, maybe 25 something like that, and we had a management course at a recruitment company, and it all the trust exercises and this, that, and the other, and how, you know, all the different fancy management things that were fancy then, some of which have moved on, some of which are still relevant. And in the organisation I was in at the time, it's sort of, wow, we walked out buzzing, and then several weeks later we're like, back to the grind, and it didn't have much of a transformation. So of all the sort of people you engage, what percentage of an organisation do you think come out the other end truly transformed, and how many have a buzz that wears off?
You have to really work at this. It's just like, you know how when you go on a course that, I think isn't it, you lose 80% of the information within a few days of walking out. It's exactly the same.
Right, yeah.
You really, and just because you might reach that pinnacle of being democratic doesn't mean you take your finger off the pulse. Anything, far from it. And we do have stories of organisations that have gone backwards because they've taken their finger off the pulse. Yeah. And they've not necessarily put culture on the ticket when they've been doing M&A deals, or, you know, it's really important to make sure that your organisational culture is up there with your financial, I believe. Because
that's an interesting point, actually, Miranda. How do you sell it? We've probably all heard that on a lot of CFOs' agendas right now, it's talent. They're all talking about it. It's important to us. It's part of our strategic plan. But I don't think that many organisations know exactly what they're going to do to bring talent into their business and to kind of re-energise it. So how do you sell this concept to a CFO who's looking for, well, what is it going to bring to the bottom line? And they're all about delivering value to their shareholders.
The way I do it is by example, showing those organisations that have been through that process. HCL is the biggest example, as I've said. They grew 21% year on year. DaVita invested, they really invest a heck of a lot of time and money in this, but they've seen the bottom line benefits because they're now a Fortune 400 company with 12 billion in revenue and 50,000 employees. And, you know, in 1999 they were nearly bankrupt.
I guess so you've used a couple of examples where the companies were almost at breaking point. So it was kind of okay, we do this, or we're going to absolutely fail. But it's the ones maybe that are in the middle that are just plodding along. They're creating value for shareholders, but maybe not as much as they could. I guess those are the ones that are hardest, aren't they, to get them to convert and have the impetus to make that change. Because from what you said, it's quite a significant change culturally. It needs investing time in it.
I think you're right, and I think in most cases in our lives, change never really happens, does it? Until we've got a really difficult catalyst that's forcing that. And most of the examples I would have been from that standpoint. If your HCL were doing okay, but they recognised that they were at risk of losing market share, and that's what forced a change for them. That's not quite so bad as being nearly bankrupt, obviously. But to give you an example outside of our realm, look at Apple. They were 30 days away from bankruptcy just before they launched the iPod, and it was the iPod that saved their business. So change.
But they've changed through product innovation.
Exactly.
That's what I was going to say. For instance, could you have saved HMV? I'm being flippant a little bit, but could you have saved HMV by a culture change? Well, by a culture change, because there's a lot of people said you've got people sitting there. It's an outdated business model, but also, at some point you got staff that weren't nearly as good as your local record shop who really cared about records. They just thought, you'll get me for college. So is there? You probably wouldn't have saved it single-handedly, but could you add an impact?
Absolutely. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't think we could. Okay. So I think you can, and I think too many companies don't give culture the time that it needs, because culture innovation, as all these organisations have shown, is what's made the difference for them. It's right for some, it may not be right for others, but it's
I think with that HMV example, I would really love to think that somewhere somebody in that company was thinking, or at least saying to themselves, we've got the wrong business model here.
Their advisor wrote that article. They told them back in 0405 that these were the threats they faced. They said that downloading was a fad, it would never last. Online retail stores will never replace high street because people want the experience of shopping. And the third one was about undercutting the supermarkets. They could see that off because serious music buyers would never go into a supermarket. So then there were, so in Kodak, there were people in the organisation who said, but this is changing, why aren't we doing anything?
But isn't that down to the culture?
That's right.
Exactly.
But when you've got people at the top who have made a very successful business because they assume because of their own abilities and foresight, but actually they just effectively ridden the surf on a growing market. And what saved HMV first time was CD. Was everybody then trading up buying CDs, and then DVD saved the second time. So, but unfortunately, you obviously had people in the organisation who felt it was their brilliance that did it, as opposed to the market.
That's it. And they were blocking probably the ones.
I think it has to be seen, because there was a good debate around the time of Kodak. You know, why weren't people in the organisation kind of pushing against management to say that all this changes, which comes back to the discussion we had in a different track earlier. To what extent, you know, are people engaged with an organisation? To what extent are they there for the paycheck? And if they're engaged but they need the paycheck, and management says no, you're wrong, we know the way to go. I think it's the top that has to start this change. I guess, unless you've got an example of one where it wasn't.
No, I think it does come from the top. Absolutely. It often starts with the demand, sometimes from people at the bottom, but the change is never going to begin until people at the top allow it to happen and are prepared to model that behaviour themselves, because your employees are going to be looking to you to guide through this, to, you know, changing from being a hierarchical command and control model to being a freedom-centred model doesn't happen overnight. And I think a lot of people think, oh, we'll just apply these principles and that's it, we'll be democratic. That's far from it. It is a very big mind shift.
But do you see things like, for example, social collaboration tools like Yammer or Chatter that suddenly open up that audience, you know, cross, and it breaks down those silos, doesn't it? And you've got, that's a kind of, I suppose, a democratic tool. I'm not suggesting, but perhaps some of those things then start to open eyes about, my goodness, you know, look at the value here that we've got in the business that perhaps was unseen before.
Yeah, it goes back to the same, you know, the adoption of social media. It's the same thing.
But I think something like a Yammer or a Chatter that's internal probably has a bigger impact in the C-suite or in the boardroom, because social media, by its very nature, is generally outward-facing, and they don't necessarily see all of that.
And also, they probably don't want some of those discussions to be put out in public, so their fear of social media shuts it down, whether it's an internal product.
I think it's very much there in your face, and you start to see how those ideas are drifting across different channels and you're capturing. But what do you recommend then as the next stage from that? How do you get them from something that perhaps is starting as a way of working into making it much more of a theme?
Are you talking from the social, the tool side, or just in general from
being more democratic? Generally.
Well, it does start at the top, and the first stage that we see is that leaders go through a process of development, really, to learn how to model those behaviours and really embed them in themselves, and then it trickles down into, you know, how do we as a collective in the whole company model those behaviours of transparency and accountability, and then there are a number of tools like a Yammer that can enable you to foster that and to have that collaboration, to discuss these ideas and to start thinking about, well, how do we put these into practice? I mean, you know, to give you a couple of examples of how organisations have put some of these principles into action, one of the biggest principles people tend to be clicking on these days is accountability. Menlo Innovation are a company in Michigan. They're a software development company, and they work in pairs. So you have two people sharing a computer terminal. So there's shared accountability. And they find that they get things done a lot quicker because people can work through the ideas together. And they find that there's shared accountability between a pair, and they're able to point out mistakes a lot quicker too.
And that is what was that industry? What are they doing on those?
They're software development.
I was going to say, I know in games development and some of the guys I place in IT, it's agile development, and it's
exactly. Another one, I think one of the other principles that really typifies these kind of organisations is high levels of reflection and evaluation. To learn from your mistakes, and it's allowing employees to, the whole organisation, to play with these ideas, to learn when things, through trial and error, things go well or things don't. I'm thinking of an organisation called Nixon McInnes, and in fact, one of their founders is going to be here tomorrow, and telling the story of how he started the organisation this way. And they have a great practice, which I love, called Church of Fail. And they once a month set up a meeting room with pews of chairs and an altar up at the front. And you get up and you confess your failure, and you say, well, I failed on this project, here's how, here's why. And there's a no blame culture.
You don't get smited.
No, you just get given a beer and you go down to the pub.
Well,
I once worked at a recruitment business. There was only about 15 people, and they had monthly sessions called Wallow and Dump, where you basically went to the bar every month. The last Thursday of every month, there was like a room at the local pub, and you kind of just, it was like, it was all open, everybody there, including owner, just no holds barred, whatever's pissed you off. I'm allowed to say that on air. Over the last month, whatever isn't working in the organisation. And for a fact, the first two went fine. The third one ended on a bun fight. Everybody picking on everybody, and like, well, if you wouldn't have done that, we could have done that. And in the end, it was a massive argument. And 3 people left the following. You've got to be careful how much you bear.
It's also about how you set that environment. Clearly, you'd all had a few too many beers.
Possibly.
But it's about how you set up that environment.
Just picking up on that, you mentioned the word owners. Is there anything in the ownership construct that kind of determines or points towards success or failure, or is that too big a sort of generalisation? So if you're an owner-operated business and you've developed since the start, or you're a new startup like Zappos and you're kind of founders at the helm, do you tend to have more success with that type of construct as opposed to the large corporate shareholding construct? Is there anything, because I guess with the latter you've got so many more stakeholder considerations. Including sort of quite short-term returns on people's investments. So is there something that's around that perhaps even large corporates could learn from that owner-operated sort of construct and mentality and thought process that they could bring?
I mean, we work with several companies that are publicly traded, and but they started off obviously at entrepreneurially, and when they went through that shift to an IPO, they were very clear to make sure that culture was on the ticket, and that wasn't going to be changed, or they were going to be allowed to because they'd actually demonstrated that the culture was a huge part of the success of the organisation already. Amongst the organisations that we work with, it's a very broad spectrum of ownership model. We've got everything from, privately owned. You've got companies that are publicly traded, NGOs, and employee-owned companies too, because this kind of model would naturally work within an employee-owned model because you're all leaders. You all have a stake in the business. I think obviously there's more risk for those companies that are publicly traded, I would think. They feel a higher level of risk and also responsibility to their shareholders. But they have already, usually, from what I can see, demonstrated their capability. However, we are working with organisations who didn't start that way and are publicly traded and do want to change their way they work because they've seen this model working elsewhere and they're thinking, this might work for us.
Just sort of picking up on Rachel's point about the drivers for realising that you need to change. have you worked with any organisations where they're doing pretty well, they're fine, they're quite static within the market, but they see a massive opportunity over there that actually they could grab as well?
Yes.
And actually to go and grab that, they need to be a different enterprise than the one they are now. So they need to not just start up something new that sits over here, but they actually need to fundamentally change the whole culture of the organisation to go and grab that thing over there.
Yeah, we're actually working with an organisation right now, and because for confidentiality reasons I can't name them, but we're doing that's exactly why they're doing this. And also it goes back to partly the Gen X, Gen Y demands. They're recognising that in order to attract talent, they've really got to change the way that they operate. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And when the organisation started 15 years ago, everyone said to our CEO, "You're mad," and now a lot of people are actually saying, "This makes sense because we've been through, we're going through a recession, and the old model in a lot of these organisations can't apply anymore."
Do you think because has the pace of change, has it accelerated because of that now? Because people want kind of quicker decisions, or is it just depends on the organisation?
It's interesting. It's such a double-edged sword because, yes, the pace of change is quick. People do want change quickly, but they also have to recognise that change is also a slow process if you're going to get it right. And if you're going to get it right, you have to have the mindset and the right design underpinning the organisation. If you have a culture that doesn't have that underpinning the organisation and things go wrong, they're not going to be as resilient, in our opinion, and from the research that we've done. So it's fast and it's slow. And I think, for those organisations that are really action orientated, it's a really hard one to actually recognise that in order to change, they need to slow down and make better decisions collectively.
I guess it's about as well whether they just want to pay lip service and kind of get the accreditation, or whether they want that sustainable change that will fundamentally maybe make them question the business model as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether they're brave enough.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said before, we've had companies that have gone down the road, have become democratic, and you very quickly work out whether they're playing lip service because they'll take the metric 1 year, the survey metric 1 year, do really well, and within a year or so, if they've taken their foot off the gas, they can be uncertified and not on the Worldblu list anymore, and that is a really big catalyst for change for them. They've realised that something's gone wrong, but usually because they've been down this process already, they recognise the steps that they need to take, they just recalibrate slightly, and it's not like they have to go all the way back through a process again. They've just got to look at, well, where did we go wrong? Is it our systems and processes? Is it our leadership? Is it what we're doing as a bunch of individuals? And yeah.
But presumably there are democratic companies that tick all the boxes of fantastic companies, but hit the buffers as quickly as anyone else if their business model isn't right or they don't have the product. So it's not a panacea. It's,
no, it could be a nice place to work, but
nice place to work, from be equally out of a job in 10 weeks' time if whatever the company is doing isn't right for their particular market or whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, and we've seen that too. I would say that's a minority within our community, but it does definitely happen. You have to have the right culture and the right operating business model to enable it to happen.
I think we're kind of running to a natural close, so I just wanted to pose a little question before we all head off, because we had a lot of blank faces when Miranda asked us if we knew what a democratic workplace is. So I just want to know what everybody's going to take away, and if somebody asked you outside, so what was the track and how did it go, and what is a democratic workplace? What does it mean to you now? So should we start this way?
I mean, I would probably. I mean, I've always tended to be involved in startups and all big transformations of change. And I guess for me, it's almost as if you shouldn't have to prescribe what a democratic workplace is. I think anything that starts up from scratch and is successful tends to be a democratic workplace anyway. So I think probably for me, it's sort of helped me to understand that perhaps what a lot of people that need to change, whatever that reason is they need to change, is it's almost to kind of to recapture what it was that perhaps made it successful in the first place, which was to allow everybody to chip in to make this thing actually come up. So yeah.
Non-hierarchical, empowered, open, collaborative, open decision making.
I think empowered is absolutely the word, and I think it's about breaking down those silos as well and encouraging much more inter-company kind of communication to foster better results. Community.
Yeah, for me it's about being brave. I think a lot of examples I heard from you, I just kept thinking that CEO is brave, that workforce is brave, so it's just about being brave and taking on the rest.
Well, for me, I mean, I recruit IT people mainly into startups, so they've kind of got that already, at least at the early stage, before the IPO perhaps. But perhaps when I as a recruiter go to a large organisation, maybe it's something that I should be inquiring about and suggesting, it's to see where they're at on that level, and whether maybe I could help them attract better people if they were a little bit more like that. So.
Yeah, my takeaway would be that you can see these changes in the society that are going on through new communication technologies, and the same is going on in organizations and in companies. But it takes a little more time, because it's hard to actually change. As you said, like, you need to really like a reason to change something, and that's what I take away.
Absolutely.
I think I take away that it's a very interesting concept that clearly some companies are doing without really thinking about it, but the fact that that it exists and you can be certified for it to help gain more staff or whatever has got to be a good thing. So I'm really interested to hear everything that's been said.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.